Hello, all, and welcome to our second Digital Leadership Book Club, streaming live on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube, as we do with all of these social media platforms. Use those to get out good conversations and digital storytelling, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. My name is Josie Alquist, and I am excited that if you are joining us live today or watching the replay, let me know who is joining. Say hello in the comments. That's why we want to use a tool like live streaming, because we get to interact and it's not through Zoom. So that is a win that I am all for. I'm streaming in live from my quarantine home in Los Angeles. If you checked out the book launch party or kickoff, this is where I hosted a little party in my office. And that's where I also shared that throughout the month of October, November, I'd be kicking off a book club where I invite on features from the book to talk about why I featured them, what they can learn from you now, and just overall higher education and leadership and social media, at least for October, whatever the date is today of 2020. So if you have not yet picked up the book, this is the very brief infomercial for it. You can grab it on Stylus, which is the publisher, or Amazon. It does sound like some shipping got a little bit delayed, but don't you worry. It will be coming to you hopefully very, very soon. And that's the other benefit of this live stream series is you can start to learn about digital leadership and learning from other folks, role modeling these practices out into the field right away. If you're really looking for some digital community building, I also have a digital community called the Digital Leadership Network. I'm going to drop that into the chat right now. And it's kind of like a book club meets digital community where not only these recordings will live, but then we get to have conversations about different chapters. You can interact with myself as well as the features, and then just have some good old social media fun. So again, I would love to know who's catching, who's jumping in and checking out this live stream today. I'm very excited about my feature that I'm going to bring on in just a moment. Let me know though who you are, if you picked up the book, or heck, let me know any books that you're reading right now. I'm finally feeling like I have like the brain capacity to read, which I know feels a little alarming, but that was one of the things. Once we went into quarantine, reading just went out the window. Like a lot of other things came in, like maybe like a Peloton and more walks with my dogs. But so I'm finally getting reading back on the table. So I'm pretty happy about that. So hopefully this is a book maybe that can be on the table for you. Okay, so today's conversation, last week we talked with Kristen Abel. She created a series called The Committed Project that explored mental health in higher education, and she is also working in marketing at Virginia Tech and managing what that means now for marketing professionals in any industry. And today we get to talk to another feature in the book, Matthew Reed. He is the Vice President for Learning at Brookdale Community College and a writer for InsideHigherEd.com, which is originally where I found him. He is an epic blogger, very active on Twitter as well, has a lot of good things to say. So I knew I wanted not only to get him in the book, but also to get into this live stream to talk about community college, blogging, Twitter, and all the good stuff. So please join me welcoming Matt onto this book club. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we were just, honestly, introducing ourselves to each other before we push play. This is the very first time that we've actually met in real life. It is real life on the internet, but what a fitting way to do that. So welcome, Matt, to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's talk first about your pinned tweet. I thought this might be a fun one.
Yeah.
And I can see your eyes like, what's my pinned tweet?
Yeah.
It's from a few
Okay.
years ago.
Yeah.
And you say, I wish Twitter would distinguish between favorite and save for later. People could infer some pretty misleading things. So give us a little background on that.
Well, in
Call
my
out to
defense,
Twitter.
that was before the bookmark feature came out. So at that point, it was just, to save something, you'd like it. And I realized I was liking some things to save them. I wasn't liking them because I liked them. And I was afraid that, people can see your likes. And I was afraid that someone might go through and say, I can't believe you like that, thinking it was approval. And it's not approval. It just means, save for later. So I put that up there and realized, let me just leave it there just to fend off any, misinterpretations. It seems to work.
Yeah, it could also be an extension of your bio, how some folks say, like retweets aren't endorsements, which we
Right.
can kind of argue around that. But some folks don't realize that there is another column on Twitter of everything that you ever have liked, which might be more revealing of
Yeah,
oneself than they realize. So
exactly. Yeah.
anyway, it's so interesting to like both read people's bios but see what their pin tweets are. Just I think it always gives us just a little insight into who those people are. So tell us a little bit about how you got started on Twitter. Do you remember when you first jumped on, and then in what context then it got going with your work in higher ed?
Yeah, well, I started blogging years before Twitter.
Okay.
I started the blog in 2004, which in internet time was prehistory. No, I had been at DeVry for a few years, which is a for-profit college, and then had switched over to County College of Morris, which is a community college in North Jersey. And there was just this huge culture shock for me because I had gone from this very corporate, sort of fast-paced, ethics optional environment to one that was much more traditional, tenure-based, unionized, and the change was disorienting. And the way that my mind works, I process things by writing them. So I started writing stuff down. And blogs had just become a thing then, like early 2000s. They were still kind of disreputable. People got fired for having them. No, literally, they did. So I started with a pseudonym, Dean Dad, because those were the two roles that took most of my waking hours. I was either being a dean or being a dad. And did that for a few years. Inside Higher Ed came along in 2007, said, we really like what you're doing. Can we run it? To which I was like, yeah. So it's been running there ever since. 2009 is when I started Twitter. And it was actually based on, there's this blogger named Penelope Trunk. She did, I don't know if she's still writing actually. She used to do this really bizarre sort of career advice column that was, I couldn't decide if it was narcissistic or brilliant, but it was always like compelling to read, and she sang the praises of Twitter all the time. And I thought, well, all right, let me go on and look. It took me a little while to kind of get the hang of it. But once I realized, oh, people talk about it as a social network, and it is, but it's also this amazing, like, self-updating annotated bibliography where people will tweet out links to articles and they'll put a little like commentary in the tweet, good piece on blah, 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 link. It's like having this army of research assistants working for you for free all the time. It's incredible. So I started following those, and over time, it just became integral to what I do. I started meeting people through Twitter that I would never have met in real life. You would be an example of that. Then when my book came out, I dropped the pseudonym, and then it started sort of, the Twitter feed caught on some more. But it's been really helpful just there's this wonderful like equality on the internet. On campus, there's very much a sort of stratification that there's like faculty and there's administration and there's vice presidents and deans, and there's all sorts of like ranks. And communication is often sort of mediated through rank, but online there's really not. And so you get this wonderful exchange of ideas, sometimes a little raw, sometimes sort of maddening, but the unfiltered part is part of what makes it good. It's part of what makes it valuable. So yeah, I've been doing that now for 11 years. It's kind of amazing, actually.
Yeah, sometimes when you start to count things up, you're like, oh goodness. And that's a long time in internet years and
really
moments and days. So, and I love your frame of it. That's what I found. I fell in love with Twitter when I was getting my doctorate, and I would read an article and then I would go see if that, like person that wrote it was on Twitter, and then connect with them and let them know I was reading the article, or then, eventually finding them on LinkedIn. So having that reframe, and especially for academics, scholars, faculty, and they can be my hardest group I get in front of to document the value of it, because Twitter is not perfect. No platform is. So having that frame to go in with a really clear intention, I appreciate that. And then I can use examples like yourself as follow Matt.
Well,
things.
Bean Dad, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's been terrific. I've run across people I would not have run across otherwise.
Yeah.
Just today, someone I ran into originally on Twitter, Tressie McMillan Cottom, just won a MacArthur Genius Grant. Cool. So now I get to say I know a genius. That's kind of cool, That wouldn't have happened if not for Twitter.
In one of the pieces you wrote in Inside Higher Ed that I featured in the book was your reaction to another article and there's been a few articles that have came out throughout the years about, social media being used for self-promotion, especially within scholars or academics, or that it's not serious enough. So what is your view about that, challenge that it really putting ourselves out there in that way really is self-promotion. But again, what's your angle more towards it, that for the value?
Well, you're talking to someone who wrote under a pseudonym for years. So self-promotion wasn't the top of my agenda. If it was, I would have used my name. It's different when you're writing as an administrator. I can put however many disclaimers I want on my Twitter feed. It's still going to be read as Vice President of Brookdale says. And I have to be careful. There are times when folks who are not in positions of management or administration, there's a sort of freedom that comes with that. But when you're in one of these roles, you really have to think, okay, how is this going to be read? And how is this going to be read by people who might not know me all that well, or who might have other agendas? So there's a lot of sort of snarky tweets that I compose in my head and never write, because I can just imagine how they'd land. So I have to be much more sort of circumspect about it than if I were just starting out. I kind of envy the freedom that a lot of newer arrivals have, who have unfettered freedom to say more or less whatever they want. I kind of don't. So I have to be careful. There's a lot of, if you read my stuff long enough, you can kind of suss out my political perspective, and you can suss out attitudes on some stuff, but it's very calculated. And I don't mean that in a sinister way, but just out of protection. I don't want, if I go off on a rant about some public figure who's annoying me that day, I don't want the college to suffer for that. So I don't go off on the rant, even though I really could. And part of me wants to, but you can't. You just have to be very careful. So I go in very aware that Twitter is a public venue. Even though it feels private, it feels sort of intimate in the moment, but it's actually really public.
Sure.
And there's no shortage of examples of people who got a little too comfortable on Twitter and tweeted some stuff they probably shouldn't have and got in trouble for it later. So I have to be mindful that however much I'm still the same person that I was in grad school, less hair, but otherwise. But I can't think that way on Twitter, that on Twitter I have to own the role that I'm in. even though it would be a lot of fun sometimes to kind of go off on rants. You kind of can't. And so I think that's part of the reason that many folks who are, presidents, vice presidents, deans, either don't do social media or do it in a really vanilla and sort of uninteresting way. Because it's hard to be both interesting and safe.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place.
Kinda, yeah. So it's much more of a high wire act in some ways. Again, if I were in grad school, I'd just let it fly. It wouldn't matter. But at this point, that's really not an option.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at it as, okay, there will be people in the community whose politics are very different from mine, whose support for the college is important. And I don't want to alienate their support for the college by sort of going off on some self-indulgent little tirade. So I don't. At the same time, though, the whole silence is complicity thing is real. So you don't want to just ignore anything controversial, because at that point, why bother? Then it's just public relations. So you have to kind of pick your moments. So what I'll try to do, my academic background is political philosophy. So I'll try to kind of step back and take the longer view. So I won't write anything about the latest scandal involving Trump, whatever it is that day, and there's no shortage. But I might write something about the importance of the rule of law. Folks can connect dots if they want to, but I'm not going to go out there and say, vote for X. Or so-and-so is horrible. Because even if I firmly believe I'm right, I could wind up hurting the college, and that would be unacceptable. So it is tricky. I think there's a reason that when I started the blog in 2004, I assumed that, I would be the first of a great many academic administrators. And instead I'm, 16 years later, it's still kind of a category of one. And I don't think it's that I'm exceptionally talented. I think it's that other people saw the risk before I did. So I just kind of started. And then after a while, it was like, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, might as well keep going. At this point, there's already enough of a paper trail that anyone who wants to hang me on it can hang me on it. So whatever. But I understand why my counterparts at other places don't do that. It's difficult. I have had times when, an angry professor will show up at my office pointing to some paragraph that I wrote 3 months ago. How could you possibly? So then I have to reread it and remind myself, okay, what does that mean? I can say with a straight face, I've never written anything personally attacking anyone I work with. I don't do that. And I don't personally attack private figures ever. I'll attack public figures occasionally, but only on their public stuff. But they will, take issue with something that they think implies something. So I have to be very careful. And that's why, the Twitter feed starts with, just because I like tweet doesn't mean I endorse it. Because I could imagine someone saying, someone tweets out a report on declining public subsidies for higher ed. And I like the tweet so I can go back and read the report later. I don't want someone to say, oh, so you like cuts to public higher ed? Because people will. So it's a very difficult balancing act. And I don't blame a lot of my colleagues for not wanting to try it. In retrospect, I think the pseudonym enabled me to kind of get better at it when nobody was looking. So, kind of like, the Beatles had that time in Hamburg when they were in the club and only like 50 people were ever there, and they got good when they were in Hamburg, and then by the time they came out, they were actually good. Kind of like that I had like the Hamburg years were my pseudonym years. And so by the time the pseudonym dropped, I'd had enough experience that I kind of knew, okay, don't feed the trolls and don't take the bait, and you don't have to signal every single belief you've ever had. But at the same time, there are certain core beliefs that come through, because I'm not just, my title is not PR director. I do have thoughts on things and try to put those out there to further a conversation.
Well, I appreciate that you brought up the word values and your whole discernment process within your online presence, like in making those choices, being able to use that self-reflection to sit with that. I think is another big piece of the book. And I think just hearing each of our own processes of that navigation, even the fact that you called it like a high wire, or like, I mean, that is very telling of like potentially what is at stake for a very public leader to be on social. But where's the sandbox? Like, you had the early days to like sort that out, right? And how do you get sand out of your eye while you're on a tightrope? Like that's significant. And social's not right now a requirement, or like blogging.
Right.
So for me, my lens is the more we can show examples for folks to react to, sit with, learn from is definitely my goal for it. As social seems simple and silly, but I mean it's significant. It's real.
Yeah.
So, but talking about like, okay, all the blogging that you've been doing over time, some faculty member using your words to like challenge, like a paragraph that you wrote months ago. But you also found, I think it was your current role, this was a benefit to your president from you blogging and tweeting. So tell us a little bit about that, how that paid off.
Well, I'm able to draw on experiences of other people in other places that I otherwise wouldn't be able to draw on. As a vice president of a community college in central New Jersey, there's no particular reason I would come into contact with somebody like a Paul LeBlanc, who's the president of Southern New Hampshire University. We just travel in very different worlds. But we kind of met online, which led to meeting in person, and we kind of clicked. And so, last year when we heard about Southern New Hampshire doing some of these 3+1 agreements with some community colleges, and our articulation person was having a hard time getting through, I was able to just tweet at Paul and say, Paul, can you have someone give us a call? We'd love to do this. Cool. That afternoon, someone called and said, we heard you're a friend of Paul. And that got it going. And so we were able to get the agreement. And now we have a 3+1 with Southern New Hampshire. Right. I was able to kind of cut through multiple layers of stuff because we had sort of struck up this relationship. That wouldn't have happened if not for social. And so it has been a wonderful resource in that sense. Right. There's always a risk. Every so often you get into kind of a tiff with somebody. But as a writer, you have to kind of make a choice about your writerly persona. So what kind of writer do you want to be? And in the early days of blogging, I noticed the blogs that got the most traffic tended to be the most polemical, like the angriest, or the most sensational. And I made a decision really, really early on that that's not who I am. My brother likes to say that I channel Bob Newhart a lot. So I decided, all right, if you're going to be Bob Newhart, own it. Like, be the best Bob Newhart you can be. And so instead of going for sort of cheap sensation, I went for sort of thoughtful, on the theory that niche was less crowded. And also I'm just better at it. I'm not a great polemicist. And that meant settling for building an audience slowly, as opposed to going viral with, going off on someone. But that's okay. I intend to be in this career a while. I've been in it a while. I intend to be in it a while more. And you build trust slowly. You can lose it quickly. So I made the decision, all right, I'm playing the long game here. I'm not necessarily going for the top, most read piece on Reddit on a given day. But just over time, you kind of build credibility. So it's been a slog. It's been a
well, bonus that you
deliberate slog. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, but it's, yeah.
Well, consistency is something that comes up in the book over and over, that you can't jump on and expect all these fireworks, or if you do have them, that they may not show up, like all the time. And so always rooting it back into like, okay, what is my focus? Let's not get distracted by all this other noise that the internet can present so darn often.
Yeah.
Um, but you are, again, this, if you call it a slog, I'll call it consistent, but you are, and I'm a blogger, but you are a blogger. Like, you are like consistently putting out content for a very, very long time. So I would love to just know your process. Like, do you use certain tools to help ruminate thoughts? Do you ruminate thought, but like organize thoughts? Like, do you have a schedule? Yeah, I would love for people to kind of hear about that.
Yeah. I guess a few things. The first is I don't call it a blog in my head. In my head, it's a newspaper column. That growing up, I loved Dave Barry and Ellen Goodman and Art Buchwald and Irma Bombay. I mean, all these like 70s and 80s newspaper columnists. I just thought they were great. And I kind of wanted to do that, but I was born too late. So I went into this other line of work, but I found a way to kind of do that on the side. So to me, in my head, it's writing a column as opposed to a blog. And the difference is it's long form prose. It's not a whole bunch of little bullets most of the time, except for Fridays. Sometimes on Fridays I'll do that. I write 5 nights a week, typically, Sunday through Thursday, to be published Monday through Friday, usually around 9 o'clock at night, at the kitchen table, facing diagonally. I've got a whole ritual. My wife at this point understands, okay, when you're in that position at that time, that you're writing, so that's fine. And it's not that 9 o'clock at night is the best time to write. It's really not. It's just until then I'm working. I'm either, at work or at the version of work we're doing now, catching up on emails, making dinner. There's just other stuff. So it's a later at night thing. I have been asked, how do you keep doing it? And my answer is some people jog and I blog. It's just a habit. You just develop a habit. And once you develop a habit, it's just there. 20 something years ago, I met the sociologist Richard Sennett, who's this brilliant thinker, just recently retired, who wrote a whole bunch of books, really classic books in his 20s. Like one right after the other for several years in the 70s. And I remember asking him, I did the math and I figured out you wrote like a classic a year for like 6 years. How do you do that? And he said, well, as a kid, he was a cellist. And as a cellist, you practice every day. So as an adult, as a writer, he writes every day. And I remember thinking, oh, it can't be that simple. He's kind of right. You just have to keep going. If there is a secret to writing, I'd love to know it. I try to write like I talk. I don't try to write like an academic. So I want it to be readable. And that was a choice I had to make. I went to grad school in the 90s when postmodernism was the thing. And so I had to use like 14 syllable words. And I had to kind of unlearn that and say, no. If I'm writing a newspaper column, I want it to be readable by the kind of people who read newspaper columns. Right. So no footnotes, no, I don't problematize. That's not a word I use anymore. And it's for a while when Inside Higher Ed still had comments. I got this wonderful little community of readers going where I could start to imagine who they were as people. And it started to feel like a conversation, which was great. They recently did away with the comments section. I think it was a cost-cutting measure, which I still kind of miss it. That hurt a little bit. I'm not gonna lie about that one.
I was curious about that. I didn't know if it was to more minimize the pushback, maybe. But I mean, tech tools do come with cost.
I interpreted it as they just couldn't continue to pay someone to do that. I know they took a hit when COVID came. Sure. But it may have been editorial. I don't know. But I miss my wife's worldly readers.
Well, even to have the lens of going into the comments as your community. I always saw that on YouTube for, back early days of YouTube, you'd see these communities building just in comments, and the same within blogging communities too. So
Mhm. Yeah. Then you start to anticipate, if I write such and such, I know, Betsy Smith is going to say X. And sure enough, she would. So kind of like the way that musicians will write for the players in their band. And it's the same kind of idea. So when they did away with the comment section, that hurt a little bit. Every so often I'd write a piece that would end with a question. How do you handle blah, 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 hoping to get a comment thing going in the comments. I can't do that anymore. And it kind of, I feel that loss.
Are you trying to transform that into Twitter or on LinkedIn or? Okay.
More Twitter. I got to admit, and this sounds horrible, I don't get LinkedIn. I just don't get it. It's weirdly static, and it's very, I'm on it because I feel like I'm supposed to be.
Sure.
But I don't get it. Twitter feels much more real to me.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of, within the house, we kind of allocate social networks by person. So my wife is on Facebook. I'm not. I'm on Twitter. She's not. The kids are on Instagram and Snapchat. We're not. And you can only handle, and you can only handle so many networks, so I kind of feel like if I went on Facebook and Instagram, and I would never get anything else done.
Right.
So I had to
I'm glad you even reflected that out, is that it's okay just to focus on one or two. And I mean, my joke is that LinkedIn needs to call me. Like I have feedback.
So you seem to get LinkedIn.
But also they just added stories. I'm like, we don't need LinkedIn stories, which is basically like Instagram stories. But I guess I also thought Instagram didn't need stories when those first came out either, because I like Snapchat, which originally. So anyway, the internet wheels continue to turn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, again, you've been blogging consistently, and there's always a lens of some kind of leadership and a lot of times future thinking. And you wrote recently about we need more leaders with ethics and moral character. Explain how you're seeing that currently situating right now, as we're seeing presidents retire, like every Tuesday. We're seeing a big shift, or those that are just kind of being pushed to new types of skill sets.
Yeah. Okay. I again, with suitable vagueness. With years and years of austerity, of really tight budgets, followed by the whole COVID situation, I've seen too many discussions quickly boil down to money, and too many decisions based entirely on quick gains or quick cuts, and very little awareness of, well, where does that lead in 5 years? Where does that lead in 10 years? It's very easy for, well, anybody really, but with leaders, there's more consequence, to kind of get caught up in their own narrative and to lose sight of the big picture. I'll be as fuzzy as I can here. I know of a president at a college, not mine. Not talking about you, Dave. A college that is not mine. Where after several years of enrollment decline, and with the enrollment that was there moving mostly online, he decided that what the college needed was a great big expensive new building. Why? And in retrospect, I think the answer was he was careening towards retirement and wanted a monument. He wanted to be able to point to something and say, look what I made. To me, that's losing the thread. That's losing the point. That he had lost sight of what was good for the college, and he was looking at his own narrative. He wanted to go out on a high note, go to the ribbon cutting and then leave on the high. When in fact, he left his college with this albatross. And I see that a lot. I see magical thinking among boards in some cases where they want someone who can just sort of make the recession go away. And that's not how any of this works, but I get the temptation. And so in that piece, what I was trying to get at was sometimes leaders have to say no to what look like interesting opportunities in the short term, because over the long term, it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
And I'll flash back to DeVry on that one. DeVry was the master of the short-term decision because it was a for-profit company. So it was publicly traded. So they had to hit quarterly earnings targets. So if lowering the admission standards got you more students today, do it. And if it means your job placement numbers tank in 6 months, well, that's somebody else's problem. And that got so frustrating and maddening that I left the entire sector, went to the community college sector in 2003 and never looked back. But I'm seeing some of that thinking now in the community college world too, where just because of the incessant economic pressure, and especially in the Northeast where the number of 18-year-olds is dropping. So you've got a demographic squeeze coming with the economic squeeze. I'm seeing a lot of shortcuts. People take a lot of shortcuts, and it bothers me because I've seen how that movie ends. You know? I don't know if you've seen DeVry lately. It's a shell of its old self. It's just a sort of smoking crater. It was once a thing, and it's now this sort of shell of itself. And I would hate to see public higher ed follow that same trajectory.
Right.
But I can see how it would, and I can see some folks making decisions that have a very short-term payoff, but over the long haul are devastating. And they just never stop to think about the long haul, which is weird given that, that's what academics are supposed to be good at. That's kind of our thing. So I was kind of trying to push that a little bit on the agenda and say, not every partnership is a good partnership. Not every opportunity is a good opportunity. Sometimes you have to say no. And that's okay, even if it hurts a little bit in the moment. I feel like every parent knows that. We all have the experience with little kids,
Sure.
It's the same idea. The dean dad thing, part of the reason that works is it's the same role. In both cases, you're taking care of something and you want it to get better. But that means long-term thinking, not short-term. So, you can't reward the tantrum or you're going to get more of them. You can't give them cake for dinner every night, even if they want cake for dinner every night. Same thing with colleges. You can't sign up for every partnership. You can't build every building. You need to make choices. And I've seen a real reluctance throughout the sector to make those choices. I get it. I mean, they're no fun.
Right. Yeah. Maybe it isn't the big show pieces, the building, the award, the, whatever those, again, short-term pieces are. Is there anything else that you've written lately that that you'd want people to check out and know about?
Oh gosh. The funny thing about writing these, the worst pieces are the ones I remember.
I get that.
Because they were the hardest to write. So I had to put the most effort into them. The best ones almost write themselves. I just feel like I'm kind of channeling them. And they happen very quickly. And I don't even remember writing them half the time.
That's cool.
So I kind of need other people to tell me, oh, that was a good one. Because to me, with occasional exceptions, but generally there's like an inverse relationship between how easy it is to write and how good it is.
Yeah, well, you said like having that exact angle at your chair to sit down at 9 o'clock. And then I felt definitely some of those writer feelings when things flew. They just, time didn't exist. And that was some of the best work.
They call it flow. When you're in the flow state, it just kind of goes.
Yeah. What about some things that you're cooking up for the next few weeks that's on your mind that
I think that, the story right now that sucks all the oxygen out of the room is the whole COVID piece. And so, on my own campus, we're making plans for spring. And with that, the struggle for me is how much can I share publicly? How much can I not share publicly? So I try to talk about it in general terms, like here are the factors that go into a decision, which is, I think, fair. Every so often I'll go down, I look at Inside Higher Ed every morning and I'll go down the stories and 6 out of 10 will be COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes just stepping back from that and trying to remind myself, this wasn't always the only thing there was to talk about. There are other things, and there will be again. So let's, step back.
Mm.
I do get to switch gears sometimes because my son is now a sophomore in college and my daughter is a junior in high school. So I kind of narrated his college search, and next year I'll get to narrate her college search.
Cool.
And that's kind of fun. I like that because then I get to switch roles. And instead of being, the one in the building, I'm the one visiting the building behind the kid and hearing how they see things versus how I see things. Sometimes you forget what 18 was like. It's different.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I notice different things.
Which kind of takes us full circle because you started your blog after your daughter was born, 2004.
Almost the exact same time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then you, at least from what I understood, you kind of started first writing about stories of family and kind of realities with work-life balance from your lens. And then here we are today in debating what is work-life balance and fatherhood and leadership and quite the journey from the start of the blog to today.
Well, and that was deliberate. When I took the Dean Dad pseudonym, part of what I was trying to do in sort of the early aughts, I guess, if you call them that, there were a lot of blogs that went by names like Professor Mom or Dr. Mom, which were about work-life balance and academia. And, I read stuff before I started writing it. And I remember noticing almost everything written about work-life balance was written by and about women. There was almost nothing written by and about men. And I remember thinking, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, we're parents too, and I was very aware and very focused on, being a present dad and the sacrifices that entailed, because as a dean, you're expected to be at all these evening functions and you go to every play performance and every reception and every foundation dinner and every and they all conflict with so-and-so has a soccer game and so it was a real conflict in my world. And so I decided, okay, if we're ever going to make any progress on work-life balance, we can't just relegate it to women to solve. And that's not a shot at women at all. It's saying we all need to own it. This is a structural thing, not an individual thing. Right. And so men need to own it too. And maybe if we all own it, then maybe we can start to actually make some headway on it. So when COVID hit, and we went for the fall, Brookdale moved everything online that we could. So everything except like automotive and culinary, and a couple of art programs. One of the deciding factors for me in pushing in that direction was the K-12 system, that we have a lot of faculty and employees and a lot of students who have kids who are like K through 8, roughly, who are now home because the schools are closed. And ethically, I could not live with myself if I put them in a position where it was like, okay, leave your 8-year-old at home and come to work. Like, that's not okay. I had to think like a parent, which I've been doing for a long time anyway. So that was an easy move. But that's in a way what I was hoping to achieve in 2004, 2005 when I started that pseudonym. It was, I wanted managers to think like parents. Because we as a society do a really horrible job of remembering children. We don't build the world for parents of children. And that hurts children, and that's horrible. So when you get into a position where you can make some of these decisions, to remember what it's like when you've got the 7-year-old and the 4-year-old, because you can't just, leave them to their Zoom class. that doesn't work. That's child neglect. You can't
try it.
It doesn't work.
Trust me, it doesn't work.
I'm lucky in that my youngest is 16, and we can leave her to her devices, and that's fine. But there's a difference between 16 and 6, and we've got people who have 6-year-olds at home. The other day I was on a Zoom call with a colleague who has, I think, 7-year-old twins. Yeah. Wow. She seemed a little tired. Yeah, it's hard. And I think having, carrying that awareness forward as you sort of move up the hierarchy and saying, okay, my kids aren't that young now, but they were once. And I remember what that was like. And I don't want to put anyone else in that position. So let's, if K-12 is going virtual, we need to go virtual too. Because there are so many students and employees who have kids who are 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, who aren't going to school.
Right.
And to tell them, figure it out, would be monstrous, so that actually does play into the decision making at this point. So at least to that extent, I can say, that was a win in a way. Was able to follow through on something I intended to do 15 years ago, which was, make decisions with the awareness of some people have young kids, and what does this mean for them? Now that also has an impact on, people who have older parents at home or whatever. But the point being, we're 3-dimensional people. We have personal lives. And if you pretend people don't have personal lives, it's not going to go well. It's another one of those short-term, anyone can fake it for a couple days, but over time, no. I want my folks to be sane and balanced. I almost never call, the deans report to me. I almost never call the deans at home. Almost never, at least outside of work hours. I guess now it's kind of, you kind of have to call them because you can't meet them in the hallway. But outside of work hours, almost never contact them. I don't expect people to answer emails at 11 at night, because people have lives. And I wish that more people thought like that. I'm always sort of amazed that they don't. They don't. I wish they would. So I'm out there kind of trying to remind them. And, I see myself kind of trying to amplify and support a lot of the sort of feminist work that was done 20 years ago now about parents as workers. If we want people to be able to both work and raise children, then we need to construct work that allows you to raise children. And that requires thought, that requires effort. You don't default to that. You default to the unattached single worker. But most of us aren't unattached single workers, and children need parents. So I guess if you want to conclude on something, that would be, to go full circle from starting with Dean Dad to now thinking like a dad in this role.
Right. Yeah. Well, how much we're influenced as individuals and leaders by our life circumstances and beliefs. And I mean, I've heard a whole lot of lenses of empathy from you that influence those choices. And, we might not remember what it feels like to be 18, but to seek out to understand, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, I think that's very commendable, because we, talking about blogging and news articles, you see a lot, or you get the sense a lot of folks being guided by leadership out of fear, or at least not recognizing that there are folks that not just scared for their own health because of COVID, but they're, decisions that are being made or scenarios. It takes someone, as you called in your article, with ethics and moral character, that is a skill highly needing to be attained, and not Yeah. So I appreciate that perspective very much. Hopefully we can send this video around maybe to people that need a little nudging. We aren't poking fingers at anyone in particular. We're talking very vaguely right
Didn't
now.
name any names and won't.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Matt, I really appreciate your time. This was such a fun way to finally chat and connect.
Yeah, nice to finally meet you.
And again, just love being able to tell your story in the book about how you tell your story through Twitter and blogging. And so I just really appreciate your time. One thing that didn't come up is how much you advocate for community colleges, which I also just love.
Yeah.
So, and again, I included lots of folks from community colleges because of folks like you that kind of nudged me. You're like, hey, no one on your list is from community colleges. I was like, you were right.
Yeah.
That's horrible. And now some of my favorite, I mean, I have lots of favorites, but I love how much more we're seeing community college leadership really step out into digital platforms to have a presence. They're some of my favorite to follow and amplify. So I appreciate that.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And y'all, that's our second book club, #DigLead. That was so neat to get to chat with Matt and to hear a little bit more of his philosophy and discernment behind these tools. So many takeaways, so many quotables about walking that tightrope, leading as a parent, having that perspective, I think is so powerful. And that isn't even specifically saying like this is the how-to of Twitter, but how do those same beliefs and philosophies carry over to your social presence? Because when we see just a little bit of personalization and what I call it in the book, that offers those connections for relationship and community building. So next week, I'm going to be joined by Mordecai Brownlee. He's the Vice President of Student Services at St. Philip's College down in Texas. And he has also been telling his story and those of his community and to help educators through video series. So that's going to be super fun to be able to have him on and share. Of course, we would love to hear any ideas that you have or folks that you'd like to hear from who are based in the book. And of course, go buy the book. This is the final little promo for it. Of course, I'm super excited to finally get it out there beyond just these PDF versions that were saved in my Dropbox. But thank you so much for checking this out today, or if you are catching the replay. We'll be back next Tuesday again with Mordecai. All right, y'all take care.